Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Huzeyfe Demirtas about responsibility for consequences and how that relates to autonomous AI systems.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Huzeyfe Demirtas, who's postdoctoral fellow in philosophy at Harvard University. Huzeyfe's main research interests are in moral responsibility, free will, causation, and applied ethics, including environmental ethics, and as we'll see today, in the ethics of AI. He's published several articles on these topics, including an article called Against the Degree Scope Response to Moral Luck, or A Farewell to Responsibility for Consequences, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Philosophy, as well as an article called The AI Responsibility Gap, Not New, Inevitable, Unproblematic, which was published last year in 2025 in Ethics and Information Technology. And we're going to talk some about each of those papers today. So welcome to the show, Huzeyfe. Thank you for joining us. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Look forward to the conversation. And by the way, I want to also say that thank you for your work as well, for your published work too. It's been very helpful to me with my work as well. Yeah. So the free will question, I think I was interested in that question from an early age. I remember talking to some of my friends about the question when I was a teenager. Not just the free will question, but what it's the kind of other questions that are connected to free will, say like salvation, God, moral responsibility, God's foreknowledge, and like punishment or reward in the afterlife and so on. But it took me a while to professionally or academically focus on the question. It wasn't until I was halfway through with my graduate program at Syracuse that I started working on moral responsibility. And I got into the literature through a more Locke angle, by the way. And I ended up writing my dissertation on moral responsibility and then published a few papers over the years that involve questions about moral luck, moral responsibility, free will, and causation. And I have further work that are hopefully forthcoming.
Yeah, cool. Well, you've argued for the position that we're never morally responsible for the consequences of our actions. But before we ask you how you reach this conclusion, could you give us some examples of actions and their consequences, and also explains what it would mean for an agent to be morally responsible for consequences?
Right. So a few quick cases to maybe illustrate what I have in mind. Say someone throwing a rock at another person, or you pull the trigger of a rifle to kill someone, or you donate money to charity to help some people, right? In all these cases, you have the person setting out to do something, which then leads to moving their bodies in a certain way. Say, like, you set out to throw a rock, and then you move your body in a certain way. Say, you swing the rock, and then you release the rock flies, it hits some person, and they get harmed as a result. By consequences, I basically mean whatever that follows after you set out to do that thing, which is a mental act. And variously it is called, say, attempting to do something, trying to do something, or willing to do something, right? So whatever comes after is setting out or willing to do something. For my purpose, I call them the consequences. And yeah, moral responsibility, for better or worse, there are a lot of different meanings of the concept, and it unfortunately leads to a lot of difficulty and confusion too in thinking about the question. But to distinguish at least two of them that are going to be helpful for our purpose and to clarify the meaning that is involved in my thesis. One, first, you might think about the kind of statements like parents are more responsible for taking care of their kids, or when you say it's your responsibility to fix this mess. We're talking about people's duties or obligations, right? At that point, the moral evaluation is an evaluation of an act. We look at a certain sort of act and we say, this act has the feature of being obligatory for you. Although this is relevant in my thesis too, and in our discussion it's going to be relevant, this is not the ultimately relevant sense of responsibility that is involved in my thesis.
Right.
Which is, the other sense of moral responsibility is what is sometimes called the backward-looking sense of responsibility, or the blame praiseworthiness sense of responsibility. It is when you do something, and then we look at how you conducted yourself, and we evaluate you as an agent in light of how you conducted yourself. So it's primarily an agent evaluation rather than an act evaluation. And it's the kind of evaluation that is involved, say, in just punishment. We typically think that if we're going to punish people criminally, they should deserve it. They should be blameworthy for it. They should be guilty, right? Or when we have any justified anger towards someone, we think that they should deserve it, before we actually feel that way towards them. Or gratitude, when we feel gratitude or thankfulness towards someone, or reward them, we think they should be deserving of that praise or that gratitude, right? So this is the second sense of responsibility, which we might call the praise or blameworthiness sense of responsibility. That is what is involved in my thesis. So saying that you're responsible for the consequences of your actions in this sense, it would roughly amount to saying that you're blame or praiseworthy for the harm that occurs when you throw the rock at someone.
Right.
But we'll talk more about this, I guess, later at the end of the show.
Yeah, even that way of talking about whether you're responsible in this second sense for the harm that's caused by your attempt and then the bodily action of swinging the rock versus whether you're just responsible for the willing or the mental act of the trying. That sort of leads into the next question that we want to ask, which is about resultant moral luck. So this topic's come up on the podcast before. In particular, we focused on moral luck with Dan and Nelkin early in our series, and then with Robert Hartman talking more recently about free will and moral luck. Could you explain what resultant moral luck is, sometimes also called outcome luck? It has to do with consequences, and then explain why you reject resultant moral luck.
Right. So overall, moral luck is described as the kind of cases where something beyond your control or something due to luck makes you more or less blameworthy or affects your blame or praiseworthiness in some way. And philosophers standardly distinguish between different types of moral luck, and arguably the most problematic among them is the so-called resultant moral luck, or the outcome moral, or the consequential moral luck. Various people. And it concerns the kind of luck that's involved in the kind of consequences we bring about after we act. And to illustrate the idea here, again, if we think about the rock throwing example, once you throw the rock, once you release it, it's literally and figuratively out of your hand. Like, you don't control what's happening afterwards. It's in a way up to nature, or you might say it's in God's hands, but you're not exercising any more control to the process. And then, well, what could happen? Well, maybe a random gust of wind is going to change the trajectory of the rock, or maybe the person just in the last second bends over to tie their shoes or something, and so the rock flies by. A lot of these sorts of things could happen.
Right.
So what actually happens as a result of you setting out to harm that person is beyond your control. And if we say that, these sorts of consequences could make you more or less blameworthy, then we accept that there's resultant moral luck. And just to illustrate it quickly, maybe say you throw that rock and you harm that person. And here's another way it could have gone. Well, you throw that rock, and the random gust changes the trajectory of the rock, and you don't end up harming that person. So if the question is like, is there any difference between your blameworthiness in these two cases? And if we say yes, in the first case, say you when you harm the person, actually you're more blameworthy, then we accept resultant moral luck. Why I reject it? Well, I have a few reasons, but let me mention at least two of those. One is that I think it leads to some fairly odd implications. To illustrate one of them, say, suppose we have an assassin, they shoot their victim, right? And the victim falls down, and the assassin is like, okay, I killed this person. I'm happy. I'm going home. And the assassin goes home, just enjoying their time, watching a movie, eating chips or something. But in the meantime, turns out the victim didn't die. And some people call for an ambulance. Now we have to wait for the ambulance to arrive on time. And depending on whether it arrives on time or not, the victim might die, right? And then if it arrives on time, we're going to have to see whether it's going to get stuck in traffic somewhere. And depending on that, the victim, again, might or might not die. If it arrives at the hospital on time, again, depending on whether the doctor is, a bit tired that day after a long day of surgeries or something. The victim again might or might not die. And basically, exceptional result moral luck tells us that, look, that person is out there enjoying their day, thinking that they killed someone, they're happy. But we're out here, we're going to have to see whether the ambulance arrives on time, whether it gets stuck in traffic or not, whether the doctor is in tip-top shape or not. Depending on that, we might change our evaluation of you. That seems kind of odd to me. There are a list of these sorts of implications that follow from result in moral luck. But yeah, this is one of those. And a second one, I think, is second result in moral luck is actually in tension with some of our basic commitments as to what makes us responsible, what explains our responsibility. One basic commitment I think a lot of people have is that you can't be responsible for what you don't control. And and the other thing that a lot of people think is true is that whether you're guilty or something, whether you're blame or praiseworthy, it really has something to do with your good or bad intentions, or as it's standardly called in the literature, whether you have good or bad quality of will.
Mhm.
In that, say, like, if someone does something right, not even like something wrong, something totally morally right, but they do it with bad intentions, we tend to find them blameworthy, right? So like these two, at least like basic intuitions about what explains or what could ground blameworthiness about control or about good or bad intentions. Notice that once you set out to do something, or maybe if it's easier for people to think, once you again release the rock,
Mhm.
rest of what happens doesn't really affect how much control you exercised, whether you had any sort of good or bad intentions that gave rise to that act, right? It's irrelevant. They're happening afterwards, so they can't really affect what took place beforehand. So in that sense, we then have a picture where what we think that basically should explain or ground responsibility is not affected by the consequences of our action, actual consequences of our actions. But then it becomes implausible that those actual consequences could affect our responsibility, which then entails that there's no
Mhm.
result of moral luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most philosophers reject moral luck, but many still accept that we can be morally responsible for the consequences of our actions. And they do this by distinguishing between the degree and the scope of an agent's moral responsibility. So, could you explain the degree scope response and tell us how you object to it?
Right. So if we look at the rock throwing example, for instance, say we call one of them the successful rock throwing and the other one unsuccessful rock throwing, right? But yeah, for clarity here, we hold them otherwise equal in that, like, they have equal sort of values, desires, intentions, beliefs, control, and so on. All that differs is that what happens after they release the rock, basically, right?
Right.
And so yeah, in the successful rock thrower case, she throws the rock and harms the person. In the unsuccessful case, she throws the releases the rock and somehow the rock falls short somehow due to, say, like kind of wind. So the degree scope response here basically says they are equally to blame, that the degree of their blameworthiness is the same. As in,
Mhm.
if we need to punish one of them, we need to punish the other one equally. If we're to get angry with one of them, we are to get angry equally with the other one. But the successful rock thrower is also responsible for harming someone. And
Mhm.
the unsuccessful rock thrower is responsible only for attempting to harm somebody or setting out to harm somebody. So in that, yeah, the scope of their responsibility differs, as in what they're responsible for is affected by the consequences, but the degree of their blameworthiness, that's not affected by the consequences. How blameworthy they are, that's not affected by the consequences. That's what basically the degree scope response says. And I think, at least initially, it's fairly intuitive, and I think it's fair to say that it's probably the most popular response among philosophers to the problem of result moral luck.
Yeah.
And it has, its virtues in that, you could say that it captures, or it tries to capture, something about the pro result moral luck and anti result moral luck on the intuitions, in that a lot of people do think that that gust of wind, that random gust of wind, shouldn't affect how blameworthy you are. So then we think, well, they shouldn't be differently blameworthy. But then there's the undeniable fact: one harmed a person, the successful rock thrower, the unsuccessful rock thrower didn't. So what do we make of that? And the gross scope response basically says, yeah, the successful rock thrower is responsible for harming that person. It's just that doesn't make them more or less blameworthy. I think, though, that a lot of the appeal of the view is due to unclarities or ambiguities. And I think one important question to ask here is what does it mean to say that the successful rock thrower is responsible for the occurrence of that harm, right? Or for harming that person, the actual occurrence of the harm. I think one thing we might say is that, the successful rock thrower causally responsible for the occurrence of the harm, but this is, it is obvious and everybody could accept this. It doesn't matter what you take in the result of moral luck debate, right? Or it might mean the successful rock thrower has an obligation, a duty in reparation, say like the compensation duty because she harmed someone, right? But again, this is the kind of view that everyone in the result of moral luck debate could accept. Whether you totally reject that consequences affect the degree or the scope, or whether you fully embrace result of moral luck by saying that it affects both the scope and the degree. And I'm happy to say more about it. If you reject the idea that consequences affect the scope, then you can't really account for these compensation duties. I think that's mistaken. I'm happy to say more about it in a bit. But at any rate, the other problem with this interpretation of what it is for the successful rock thrower to be responsible for the occurrence of harm is that this one involves the obligation or duty sense of responsibility. And what is involved in the moral luck debate ultimately is the blame praiseworthiness sense of responsibility. So we're interested in the question of what it is for the successful rock thrower's blameworthiness for her to be, responsible for the occurrence of that harm, right? So the second interpretation doesn't help either. That's the idea. And the third interpretation, we might think that, look, when we say you're responsible for the occurrence of harm, all we mean is that that occurrence of harm is what makes you blameworthy, or is part of what makes you blameworthy. It's part of what grounds your blameworthiness. I think, by the way, this is probably the most straightforward interpretation of that responsible for, if we take the intuitive uses of responsible for. Although I know that some degree scope response people will reject that. But then even if they reject it at that point, I don't know what responsible for means in this context. But yeah, let's get back to the interpretation that, for the successful rock thrower to be responsible for the occurrence of that harm, it just means that the occurrence of harm is part of what makes the basis of her blameworthiness, right? At that point, though, I think the degree scope response adds up to an untenable, weird kind of view, in that it now says, look, once you set out to do something, the degree of your blameworthiness, the amount of your blameworthiness is fixed, despite the fact that the full basis of your blameworthiness, what basically generates your blameworthiness, is not fully in place, right? And that seems like an odd view. So yeah, I have a few other concerns about this view, but yeah, this is basically my concern with the degree scope response, in that, once we try to clarify what it means for responsible for the actual consequence, once we clarify that phrase, either it's unhelpful for the degree scope response, or it just makes the degree scope response a bit of an odd view.
Right. Yeah. And I like the way that you press those worries against the degree scope view. I myself have criticized it in some of my papers, but I sort of land on the other side of this debate from you, embracing resultant moral luck. But you want to go the other way. You want to reject resultant moral luck, give up the degree scope response. Then it looks like we're left denying responsibility for consequences.
Right.
So the next question is, how bad is that? Is that counterintuitive, or at least revisionary? And then how do you try to show that this isn't such a big bullet to bite?
Yeah, in that it is revisionary, as some philosophers would call it, in that it makes the following kind of statements false. Whenever you say, someone is responsible for X, and that X refers to anything other than their mental act, that statement turns out to be false. And so some philosophers worry that, yeah, that means that a lot of our thought and talk about responsibility turns out false in that view. So your view comes at a lot of cost. And why exactly this revisionary implication should be like bad for a view, we could talk more about that. But I guess, let me respond to the worry itself, whether it's actually revisionary to a degree that it should worry us. I think, again, part of the worry here depends on some unclarities in that when we say you're responsible for X and X refers to anything other than a mental act, we might mean a few different things. We might mean that you're causally responsible for it, and my view is perfectly consistent with that. Mean that you can't be causally responsible for the consequences of your actions. That's true by stipulation, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that you can have obligation duties towards the consequence of your actions. That is consistent with my view too. And just to quickly give like a snippet of how I account or how I could account for this. One thing to I think notice is that obligation duties overall don't always require any sort of blameworthiness, let alone being blameworthy for a specific sort of thing. In that, if you have a pet and say you're a perfect pet owner or a kid, young kid, you're a great parent, you're not negligent or whatever. But suppose through no fault of your own, your pet or your kid or your farm animal, they cause harm to somebody, right? And by stipulation, if we're saying that it doesn't happen through no fault of your own, it doesn't make sense to say that you're to blame for it, like you're blameworthy for it, that you deserve our harsh, bad reactions or something, right? But it's still perfectly plausible that it's your duty to compensate for the harm that occurred, right? So there's no blameworthiness that's occurring here, but there's still the obligation to compensate. Or if you think, say, like you, by mistake, you take someone else's bag at an airport, right? Just mistaking it for yours, you go home and it's like, oh, crap, it's not my bag. I guess it doesn't make sense to say that, we should really get angry with you. You deserve to be punished or something, right? So in that sense, you're not blameworthy, but it is your obligation to compensate for that harm. You caused that harm. So mere causal responsibility sometimes even sufficient for blameworthiness. And in my view, say, if I'm saying that, okay, when the successful rock thrower is blameworthy only for setting out to harm that person. So in my view, yeah, the successful rock thrower is blameworthy for setting out to harm that person, and that she's causally responsible for harming that person too, right? So, and when we bring these two facts together, her blameworthiness for attempting to harm and her causal responsibility for harming that person, this could very well again account for the compensation duty. This is at least one way of accounting it. I'm not necessarily committing myself to it. I'm just trying to show that, yeah, just because I'm saying that you're not blameworthy for the consequence of your actions doesn't mean there's no room in that view to account for compensation duties. So that's not what I mean either. In that's going like whether my view is too revisionary. And here's the other thing said. All I mean when I say the successful rock thrower is not blameworthy for harming that person. All I mean by it is that she is not blameworthy because of the occurrence of that harm. I'm not saying that she's not blameworthy. Well, I'm saying that she's not blameworthy because of that. She's blameworthy for attempting to harm you. And all I'm saying is that her attempt to harm you is sufficient to generate her blameworthiness. And I think once we think it this way, it starts looking actually fairly plausible too, not only not revisionary. But here are a couple of things that I might want to add. One is that take any view or responsibility in the literature, they lead to some initially difficult to accept sort of implications. I don't see it being possible to avoid that. So if our hope is that, we're going to end up with like a theory of responsibility that comes with no cost to our everyday thought and talk or initial intuitions, that is tough. Yeah. And maybe a bit of a meta philosophical point too is that I think when we begin any sort of inquiry, any sort of philosophical theorizing or scientific theorizing, it's analogous to looking at a noisy picture or looking at something through the mist. And doing philosophy or science, for that matter, or any sort of like inquiry, the point is to get rid of the noise. The point is to go through the mist and look at that thing more clearly as we can, right? But then it's more likely than not that once we get rid of the noise, or once we go through the mist and take a clear look at it, what things seem to us like beforehand and what things seem to us afterwards, there's likely going to be some difference between the two. So we shouldn't be too afraid of the quote unquote revisionary implications so far.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. One thought that comes to mind for me is implications for punishment. So would a person who takes your view have to accept that we're going to punish the attempted murderer the same as the successful murderer?
Yeah. So one difficulty is that, going from what one deserves to what we should do is not always straightforward.
Yeah.
Because you could blame people even though they're not blameworthy, right? It could be called for. Say, like, sometimes you blame your kids not because they're blameworthy, but you think like, look, if you're a little serious with them, if you just get slightly angry with them, maybe they will notice that what they're doing is really seriously wrong, and it's going to help them realize in the future what they should do. So you're not blaming them because they deserve to be blamed, or that. Yeah, but you're blaming them because it's all things considered, maybe permissible to blame them, right? And we could do it, by the way, not with kids, but we do it with adults too. So in the same way, whether someone deserves to be punished and whether we should punish that person, that's going to be a difficult thing. So my view doesn't have any straightforward implications about how they should actually be punished. One thing you could say is that, look, if we think that attempted murderers, like those who attempt murder, deserve less punishment, then maybe we should just punish the actual murderers a little less. Or maybe we should say that while those who attempt murder, they also should be punished just as the actual murderers, right?
Right.
Or then also there could be, I think, some instrumental reasons that are getting into the picture where we might think, yes, sometimes there's going to be other reasons that tell us that, look, this is what that person deserves. And if we do it, it's okay, but we shouldn't do it. Right.
Yeah.
So from deserve to what we actually should do, it's not always a straightforward picture, unfortunately, for all of us.
Yeah.
Yes.
For sure. All right, let's talk now about AI.
Right.
And maybe a practical implication of your view about responsibility for consequences and how that connects with AI. What do you have in mind when you are talking about AI, and what is the so-called AI responsibility gap?
So by AI, I roughly mean the kind of systems or technologies that once you deploy them, they enjoy a certain fairly high degree of autonomy in that they process information on their own. They process new information actually on their own, and they act on this processing. Right. So once you deploy them, that's that's their business now. If you imagine, say, like a self-driving car, once you deploy it, now you process the information in traffic, say, like looking at the red light, looking at pedestrians, the speed of the car in front of it, and so on. And based on this processing, it just does certain things, right? Speeds up, stops, slows down, and so on. Right. And when I say acts, by the way, I don't mean like in any genuine sense of acting. I don't think the current AI genuinely acts, but whatever the label we want to give to, say, like self-driving car stopping at a red light, that sort of. So yeah, basically the kind of systems that process new information on their own and act on that processing. And some examples of that, again, self-driving cars, autonomous weapon systems like drones, large language models, say like ChatGPT or Claude, or candidate screening tools, like the kind of systems that help make the decision as to who gets a job among the applicants and so on. So yeah, these are some of the AI systems. And the AI responsibility gap, it's typically characterized as the kind of cases where we deploy an AI and it causes a harm or benefit, and no one's responsible for it. In the literature, people typically add a further condition to this because it's a bit of a weak characterization, maybe you could think. So they'll say, it's the kind of cases where AI causes the harm and no one's responsible for it, but it seems like someone's responsible for it, or it seems like someone should be held accountable or responsible for it. These sorts of further details don't really affect the kind of arguments I have in mind, so I'm not going to get into details if you don't mind. But yeah, this is roughly what responsibility gap refers to.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty new debate, new discussion, but there's already some sort of standard responses to the AI responsibility gap problem. What are some of those standard responses?
Right. So I think there are two questions to distinguish that is helpful in discussing the question, and I think like not distinguishing these two questions lead to a fair bit of confusion in the literature too. One is whether there are responsibility gaps, whether there is such a thing to begin with, and the other one is whether they are problematic in a way that counts against developing or using AI.
Yeah.
Now, these two distinct questions, and depending on whether you're going to say yes or no to these two questions, the logical space basically allows like four distinct positions that you could have. As in, like, you could say that yes, there are responsibility gaps, and yes, they're problematic. You could say no, there are no responsibility gaps, and so there's no responsibility gap related concerns. Or you could say yes, they exist, but they're unproblematic. Or a view that I haven't seen anyone defending, you could say they don't exist, but somehow it's a problem.
Right.
It's in the logical space, so I imagine someone might want to take a stab at it. But yeah, these are some of the positions that people took. So yeah, one standard sort of like argument or motivation for thinking that responsibility gaps exist is based on a control sort of argument, in that it says, look, when you deploy this AI system, by definition, it's just doing its own thing. You don't control what it's doing. And responsibility requires control, and you don't control what it's doing, so you can't be responsible for what it's doing. Right? There's one standard argument in favor of it. The AI itself is not responsible for what it's doing. At least the current AI. The current AI is not an agent, is not a moral person. So then AI itself is not responsible. You're not responsible. Then no one's responsible for what AI does. And well, you might say, so what? I guess that could be another question. And that's, I think, when the question as to like whether it's problematic comes to the picture. And typically those who defend that, yeah, there are responsibility gaps, they also say that, well, this is problematic. And one way they think it's problematic is in that if AI causes harm and no one's responsible for it, then we can't justly punish anybody when things go wrong. That's one implication they think that follows. Or yeah, if no one's responsible for the harm that AI causes, then another implication is going to be that it's no one's duty to fix it when things go wrong, or it's no one's duty to compensate for the harm that might occur, right? And these are at least two of the problems that follow supposedly from responsibility gaps. And yeah, there are a few ways some people, reject the argument that there are responsibility gaps, and they typically take it that once they show that there are no responsibility gaps, then there are no problems anyway.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Well, you offer a new kind of position in this issue, the AI responsibility gap. What's your solution to the problem?
So my solution, I don't know if it's a solution. I just basically argue that they do exist and that they're actually inevitable, but that they're not problematic, in that they don't lead to the kind of problems that I just mentioned. So one thing to realize, I think, is that when we're talking about AI that we develop and deploy, and then AI causes something, and then we're talking about the responsibility for that thing, we're basically talking about responsibility for the consequence of our actions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And like one way of presenting my argument is that it doesn't matter what view you take in the responsibility for consequences sort of debate. Under any plausible view, you're gonna end up with some responsibility gaps. So for instance, and I think we already talked about a lot of the territory so far. You could go with the kind of view that I say, the consequences don't affect the scope or degree, or you could go with the degree scope response, or you could fully embrace resultant moral luck, right? In all these views, though, there's the question, like, which actual consequence of our actions can we be responsible for, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe some people are going to think, the resultant moral luck is not that plausible, but even in that view, you're going to have to say, you can't say that we're responsible for basically all the actual consequences of our actions, right? That's going to be a crazy view. One way or another, you're going to have to restrict the subset of actual consequences that you can be responsible for. I think one very plausible way that some of the proponents of resultant moral luck, or some of the proponents of degree scope response, or actually we could involve the direct indirect responsibility distinction into this debate too, they'll typically say that, the actual consequences that you can be responsible for, they have to be previously foreseeable. And that if they are foreseeable beforehand and then they occur, then those are the kind of consequences you could be responsible for, and not the rest of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's one way to put the need to actually draw some sort of line here, that if you say that we're responsible for all the actual consequences of our actions, then you're going to have to think about, say, like the consequence of your actions 500 years down the road. It's like, it's implausible to think that you could be responsible for them, right? So there's got to be some way of just limiting these actual consequences. But when we do, there's going to be always like cases where we could imagine, or in reality, there's going to be cases where AI causes a harm that was not previously foreseeable. Right. And so you take degree scope response or fully embrace result of moral luck, you end up with some cases of responsibility gap where AI causes something, but it was not previously foreseeable, so no one's responsible for that, right? Or you take the kind of view I favor, no one is ever responsible for them anyway. So there you go. The responsibility gap is like kind of like all over the place. So one way or the other, you end up with at least some responsibility gap. So in that sense, I was arguing that they're inevitable. Not that they're metaphysically inevitable, by the way. Like once we put them in use, once we deploy them and give it enough time, we're gonna have responsibility gaps. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I basically argue that this does not really lead to the kind of problems that that a lot of the proponents of responsibility gaps think they do. In that, so one problem again was that if no one is responsible for the harm that AI causes, then there's no one to justly punish. But this just doesn't follow, in that we look at people's actions, like what they did, and we see whether they're blameworthy for their actions, right? And if they are, and if there's some people that are actually blameworthy for their actions, for what they do, then there's someone to justly blame or justly punish, right? And if there's no one that's blameworthy for their actions, at that point, though, no view is going to say that you can be responsible for the consequence that follows. So even if you accept degree scope response, or even if you accept result of moral luck, you're responsible for those consequences. They're always dependent on your responsibility for setting out to do something. If you're not blameworthy for setting out to do something, then you're not blameworthy for the consequences that might follow. So even in degree scope response or result of moral luck, it's the condition here. Responsibility for setting out to do or trying to do is the initial condition for you to be responsible for what might follow, right? So then the idea I'm suggesting here is like, we look at who's blameworthy for their actions, and if we find some people that are blameworthy, then there are people to blame justly. Fine. And if not, then there's no one to blame, and this is not a problem. In that we shouldn't want to blame people when there's no one to blame. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other problem that supposedly responsibility gaps lead to is, again, the idea that if no one is responsible for the harm that AI causes, then it's no one's duty to fix that harm, or it's no one's duty to compensate for that harm. We talked about this earlier too, but I think it just doesn't follow, in the sense that, again, blameworthiness overall is not always required for any sort of compensation duty, right?
Right.
And here's, I think, like a fairly interesting analogy, in that, again, like when you think about your pet, say like dog, they enjoy about the same level of independence and autonomy, right? In that they also process information on their own and act on their own. Like they have that sort of independence that they enjoy, right? But when they harm somebody, it's your duty to compensate for it. Whether you're blameworthy for that harm or not is neither here nor there. Right? If you're blameworthy for anything that you've done that led to that harm, it's all the more your obligation. Fair enough. But even in the absence of that, it is still your obligation. So the inference, I think, is undercut here from responsibility gaps to what we might call compensation duty gaps.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I could see some people worrying, though, that somehow denying that there's responsibility for consequences could lead us to be like almost too nice, or maybe forgiving is the wrong word, but sort of too easy on agents or the companies responsible for putting, maybe dangerous wild dogs out there. And then it looks like, well, it's not just that we really want to blame somebody and there's no one to blame, or even that like we don't have some duty to do better. It's like I think we really want to hold certain agents or groups or companies responsible for what these potentially dangerous systems might do. I'm sure you've given some thought to that or talked to people about that kind of work.
Yeah. No, I mean, so here's what I'm not arguing, by the way. I'm not arguing that AI doesn't give rise to any sort of practical difficulties, that AI doesn't give rise to any sort of moral problems, right? It's just that AI responsibility gap is not one of those problems that are theoretically we can't handle. Practically, they're going to be difficult. I totally grant that. And those practical difficulties might still be important to consider. But when the argument about responsibility gaps they're typically presented, they're like, theoretically it seems like, you end up with a picture where you have pro tanto reasons against using them, and all the theories just, all the plausible theories just imply something like that, or that we can somehow theoretically not handle these sorts of cases.
Right.
Or our theories just tell us that, we shouldn't build them or something like that. Versus, what I'm suggesting is that, look, our existing theories are, fairly well equipped to handle these sorts of cases, but they're going to be practically difficult. Totally fair enough. And we need to yet create the necessary, say, like legal substructure, legal structure to actually support these, theoretical views that we have. That's totally fair. And I think we should just do them as soon as we can, by the way.
Yeah.
And I also don't mean that, okay, this is just not a problem. Let's do whatever you want with AI. That seems very irresponsible as well. And I totally see your kind of worry that, some of these companies, they're just going to release their wild animals out there into the street and be like, it's my pet, I did everything I can. No, that's a wild animal. That's a wild animal. That's not a docile dog or rabbit or whatever. That's an elephant you're releasing into the streets, or that's I don't know, a tiger or whatever you're releasing in the streets. Oh, you're not getting away with it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If folks want to follow your work or read more of your work, where can they go to follow your work?
I have my personal website. They could look at that. And if they Google my name, for better or worse, there aren't many people with that name and Latin spelled exactly in that way. So they unfortunately for me, they won't miss. But if they also want to just contact me in case they don't have access to my papers, I'm happy to share them.
Yeah. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks for joining us.
I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did. This was great.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks again. In our next episode, we'll talk about abilities and modality, and our guest will be Barbara Vetter, professor of theoretical philosophy at Free University of Berlin.